Florida's voucher program is funneling more than $1 billion annually to private schools, and the Florida Department of Education does not regulate or even monitor what's being taught in them. We're going to explain what's wrong with that right now here on the Atheist Forum. The urban legend insists that all private schools are better than even the best public schools. Well, this myth is sustained by the adage that the more times a lie is told, the more likely it is to be believed. But the fact of the matter is that private and charter schools are not held to anywhere near the same standards as public schools, and you will be amazed at what's being taught in many of them today. And what is Project Blitz? Well, we'll find out later what that is and why it's so dangerous to all of us. Ed Golly with Jim Peterson and Judy Adkins in the Tam Talk studio, expressing the voice of atheism here in Florida. We'll tell you how to find out more about our organization, Atheists of Florida, later on in the program. Jim, these private schools using public funding are resorting to Christian publishing companies for their textbooks. Let's begin by telling our audience what's in some of these textbooks and why it is unconstitutional for the taxpayers to be footing the bill for them.
Well, these textbooks have a very interesting view of the world, one which is not commonly identified with most scientific enterprises. Or for that matter, history is also something that sometimes gets a little bent treatment. But it's worth considering, because if people are educated in the scientific method, then they will notice some strong anomalies, shall we say, some real strange things that are said in these textbooks. For instance, in one book called Life Science from Bob Jones University, they claim that Bible-believing Christians cannot accept any evolutionary interpretation. Dinosaurs and humans were definitely on the earth at the same time and may have even lived side by side within the past few thousand years. Now, how this could possibly arise, I don't know, because no one in recorded history, which would encompass at least the last 5,000 to 6,000 years, that is where we have written records of some kind, no one has ever referred to any dinosaurs, including religious writers. They've never spoken of dinosaurs.
Well, of course, they didn't even know such things existed when recorded history began from humans, because they had to find that through fossil records.
That's right. Occasionally, fossils would become unearthed, and people would notice that they were skeletons of strange animals, the like of which they'd never seen before. So they had to account for it some way, and thus you had tales of giants, tales of dragons, and similar kinds of things. Speaking of dragons, another chapter of Life Science claims that it is possible that a fire-breathing animal really existed. Today, some scientists are saying, yes, they have found large chambers in certain dinosaur skulls. The large skull chambers could have contained special chemical-producing glands. When the animal forced the chemicals out of its mouth or nose, these substances may have combined and produced fire and smoke. And there's your fire-breathing dragon. But of course, this is absolute nonsense. No archaeologist or a specialist in that area, a paleontologist is what I'm trying to say here, ever made such a claim, or even would consider it to be possible. It's biologically highly improbable, and frankly stupid. Not to put too fine a point on it. Another interesting claim is that God used, and this is more historical, and it says that God used the Trail of Tears to bring many Indians to Christ, in a book called America, Land That I Love, which is another Christian publication put out by Abeka Book Company. And it's almost deeply, it is more than almost deeply offensive, the claim that the Trail of Tears, which was the migration of the Seminole Indians here in Florida being driven out to Oklahoma by General Andrew Jackson, was an occasion to bring Indians to Christ, when in fact thousands of them starved to death or were riven with disease because of the blankets that were infected that were given to them It was a terrible, terrible.
It was essentially America's Bataan Death March, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
And of course, slavery issues are addressed the same way. These Africans just couldn't jump in the boat fast enough to come over to this country for the work opportunities that were available in the cotton fields of the southern plantations, right?
That's right, and that brings us to another book,
Right.
United States History for Christian Schools, which claims, quote, "A few slaveholders were undeniably cruel," they concede. "Examples of slaves beaten to death were not common, neither were they unknown. The majority of slaveholders treated their slaves well." However, that's an unquote at that point, but the very idea that slavery was something that in which people were treated well is absurd. The condition of servitude, of not being free, of being unable to make choices, and certainly they were not treated well.
Families were torn apart.
That's right, and lived in hovels.
And of course,
ate poorly.
In Exodus 22 in the Christian Bible, slavery is endorsed. Jesus tells you how to beat your slaves, who owns your slaves' children, how long you need to work in indentured servitude. In the Bible, we can find a contradiction for every economic or social issue that's described. They all are contradicted somewhere else, with the exception of slavery. Nowhere is there any prohibition or denouncement of slavery anywhere in the Christian Bible.
One of the reasons that you could be executed for stealing was, one of the few reasons you could be executed for stealing was if you stole someone's slave.
Worse than stealing a cow.
Yeah.
It really is, because the slave can do a lot of work.
It could produce quite a lot of
offspring,
wealth
yeah.
for their owner.
So when we hear from conservatives that this country was founded in Christian values, to a certain extent they're right, because one of those Christian values was slavery. We eventually had 4 million people working under slave conditions in this country. Oppression of women is a perfect example of Christian values. Women didn't get the right to vote for over half of the time that this has been a nation. Oppression of children. A woman couldn't even borrow money to buy a house or open a checking account as late as the 1960s. And those were Christian values that define women as second-class citizens who are subservient to men and obedient to men, still practiced in the Baptist church. And it's why the Founding Fathers were literalists. When they said all men were created equal, they didn't misstate it. Yeah, they meant all men. They meant all white men who own property. If you're poor, if you're a slave, if you're a woman, you aren't equal. You don't vote. You don't participate equally in society. And it's only our Constitution, which was a document developed without any influence from the Bible, that minorities and women have been able to gain relatively equal status in this country. By the way, 441-3000, if you'd care to join the conversation, phone lines are open. Jim, read us just a few more of the things that are being taught in voucher-funded private or charter schools in the state of Florida today.
Well, there are so many gems. It's really hard to know where to start
Be
with
brief.
them. I've already elucidated a few, but nevertheless, some of the other things that might come up is the condition of Africa. According to Old World History and Geography in Christian Perspective, a book published in 2004 for private schools, quote, "Africa is a continent with many needs. It is still in need of the gospel. Only about 10% of Africans can read and write. In some areas, the mission schools have been shut down by communists who have taken over the government." Unquote. That's an interesting perspective, because I think that if you look at Africa, what they really need, and something which they are doing actually, is development. Many people think of Africa as a place where everybody exists in the most horrible kinds of poverty and destitution. But Africa also is a place of great progress. They have magnificent large cities. In the capital of Ethiopia, for instance, has subways and tall buildings. It looks just typical of any conventional American city. In fact, in some ways, with an emphasis on mass transportation, they're doing rather well. So I don't think that Africa necessarily needs Christianity or any other religion necessarily. They have plenty of religions on their own. They certainly don't need ours, to the extent that ours have been involved in Africa, especially in certain places where fundamentalist ministers have come into play. They have created situations where gay Africans have been ruthlessly oppressed. And
well, they implemented the death penalty, I believe, in
exactly
one country at least.
Uganda, that's the one.
Thank you.
And there
For
have been
gays.
others.
If you're gay, you can be put to death.
Yes. So that's another gem that needs to be countered. Along the same lines, the United States History for Christian Schools from Bob Jones University claims that the Ku Klux Klan in some areas of the country tried to be a means of reform, fighting the decline in morality and using the symbol of the cross. Klan targets were bootleggers, wife-beaters, and immoral movies. In some communities, it achieved a certain respectability as it worked with politicians. And if that's all you have to say about the Klan, you haven't said enough.
Well, Judy, where does Florida stand with respect to education funding these days?
I didn't realize you were going to ask me that question. I don't have the statistics
out.
out.
Well, while you call it up, I think what we can say
low.
is that our conversation here is inspired by an article that came out by John Romano in the Tampa Bay Times, in which he discusses how these private schools are really teaching a revisionist form of history that's completely inconsistent with what we know happened, which is the process of dumbing down the Florida schools. And since the voucher program is gaining more and more ground every year, the taxpayers are funding these schools, and this warped sense of education, you can't even call it education, as the government of our state legislature, is abandoning its constitutional obligation to provide funding for a high-quality public school available to everyone in favor of charter and private schools that can teach whatever they want without any accountability, without any teacher accrediting, and both accountability in student progress and the financial aspects of the businesses.
Let me just clarify one thing there. Charter schools are not the same as private schools.
Oh, yes, you're quite right.
They are held accountable, although they are a for-profit. Most of them are a for-profit business, so they're not as they wouldn't be in it if they weren't making money at it. Right. And that's misdirecting some of the funds, I think.
Sure, and it's not uncommon to hear about them going out of business.
Right. In the middle of the school year, just abandoning
abandon ship, yeah. You're right.
But Education Week rated Florida school spending as an F, along with 25 other states. And in fact, in the districts, only 0.1% of students are in districts that exceed or reach the national benchmark for spending. So we're not doing well at all. And I think that this year the increase in spending was 47 cents per student, if I remember
correctly.
Yes,
you're right. And so when we say we're one of 25 other, that means more than half of the states in the union are getting an F with respect to public education funding. We probably aren't even going to talk about territories. Puerto Rico, we can imagine what that's going to be. And yet we're trying to be competitive on the world stage while we're dumbing down our schools, turning them over to essentially churches. Isn't it something on the order of 80% of the private schools in the state are religiously affiliated?
I think it's like 85%.
Yeah, I think
last statistics I saw.
So of course they're going to gravitate toward these books that want to essentially teach that the Bible is legitimate history, that the
Yes.
events that happened that those of us who are really literate know could not possibly have happened, much less even speculate about whether or not they did happen. The story of Noah and the ark, and so on, the Adam and Eve and creationism. We know these things didn't happen. We know the age of the earth. We know the age of the universe. It didn't happen a few thousand years ago. We understand that. But when these myths were developed, nobody had any science to help them understand how the world came about and how it even worked.
Biblical ideas were fine and relevant, and it was all that they could do to come up with some sort of a sketch of how the world was actually laid out back 3, 5, 10,000 years ago, when, as you pointed out, they had no science back then. So they had to explain the world somehow, and this was the most coherent ideas that they could come up with. So you can't really blame them for that. This was the best they could possibly do.
There was no malice
But
involved
I
in
do
this.
blame people today who have access to the internet and to good educational facilities, to colleges, universities, everything,
Libraries.
everywhere, that makes people have the ability to know how the universe works and what is our actual history. Who are we, human beings? How did we come into existence? And how are we made? How are we composed?
And how are we related to all other forms of life on
That's
the
right.
planet?
Yes. And
each other.
An oak tree, yes. So what do you see as the motivation behind this effort by the legislature to essentially dismantle the public school system and turn it all over to primarily the churches? And I say the state legislature, but of course we see it happening at the federal level
Yes.
too, because this is clearly the agenda of the incompetent head of the Department of Education, Betsy DeVos, who wants this country to become a theocracy.
Well, a lot of it has to do with their belief that everything should be in private hands, that government, at least government governs best, or whatever that saying is that the libertarians want.
It's working out great in Somalia, isn't
Oh,
it?
yeah.
I think that's really nice.
And in Puerto Rico even.
Yeah.
So
much
I think
government
that's a large part of it, is they want to privatize the prisons, they want to privatize the schools, they've already privatized the hospitals.
The power companies shouldn't be privatized,
Yeah,
but that's just how because of how
Yes.
it came about.
Right. So that
And the roads,
profit
too.
incentive, they feel, is the best incentive for getting anything done. I don't agree with that completely, especially, and I don't want a fire department where if I don't pay my dues to them, they're not going to show up when I have a fire, or the police department that is in private hands and can decide who they're going to
And of course,
protect.
that's
and
the
who
way
they're
it
not.
worked in Charleston 200 years ago. They had the little plates on the houses. I
Yes.
wonder why they abandoned that.
Can't
Well,
imagine.
perhaps it was because when I have the insurance and the fire department will come to my house, but my neighbor doesn't, and my neighbor's house is on fire, then they're not going to put it out. As
Right.
a consequence, my house will burn down too.
No, they come there
That's
to
why
protect
that
your
doesn't,
house.
well,
But,
they'll
yeah.
try, but usually by that point it's already
But, yeah,
aflame.
I mean, and of course those are socialist systems, right?
Yes.
The public education, the federal highway system, the fire departments. These are things that we all communally pay for and get the
Military.
benefit from. Pardon me?
Military.
Right. And so, I hear conservatives have such a hostility toward anything socialist, and I wonder if they ever stand back and look at how much we already have in our culture and how well it's worked for us. Nothing has worked better, I think, to put this country on the world economic stage as its leader than a good public education system, so that workers can actually function in an environment where they need to know how to read and do math and
And it's
be
only going to
productive.
get more important as technology comes along, and
Yes.
we have to
And we
know
have-
more, in a sense.
And yet,
And we have
And,
increasingly high levels of unemployment because artificial intelligence, robots, automation, all that is going to make the jobs of a great many present workers obsolete.
And many people don't understand that much of our health, our improvement in health and well-being in this country was due to public sanitation. And I certainly don't want to go to a private sanitation, even though we have privatized parks.
Whoops.
Whoa.
And where would we... You're listening to the Atheist Forum on the Tan Talk Radio Network. Comes to you courtesy of Atheists of Florida.
Give the phone.
Say it again.
Why don't you give them the phone number, Ed?
Because we are going to take a short break and tell you a little about Atheists of Florida and the organization that is interested in the civil liberties of atheists and protection of state-church separation in Florida. When we come back, we're going to talk about Joy Behar and the fuss that revolved around her appraisal of Vice President Mike Dentz's religious opinions. So stay with us here on the Tan Talk Radio Network. Atheists of Florida is a nonprofit membership organization founded in 1992. For over 25 years, Atheists of Florida has brought atheists together to address state-church separation issues, provide legal assistance in cases of religious discrimination in employment or educational institutions, help atheists meet others who want to live their lives free of religion, and produce the Atheist Forum. For membership information, visit our website at atheistofflorida.com, where you'll find our newsletters, annual reports, statement of purpose, and information about meetings and events. That's atheistofflorida.com. Our quote of the day is, if you talk to God, you're spiritual. If God talks to you, you're nuts. We've all heard that. I don't know, maybe from George Carlin to some of the world's great philosophers, but it speaks to a lot, I think, to what Behar said on The View when she said that, she said something that was considered offensive about Vice President Mike Pence. Back in February, she was likening his religious beliefs to a mental illness, and her comments drew condemnation from the vice president, and of course a lot of other people. He considered it religious intolerance. Well, she went ahead and apologized, but I think she really didn't owe him one, and I certainly wouldn't, for saying that religion is a form of insanity, because I think we never really objectively appraise the message of Christianity, which is that we are all inherently horrible people. We're all sinners. We all shouldn't even be allowed to live because we're such horrible people. And as our friend Joe Reinhardt, who is usually in studio with us, points out, religion invents the disease, which is sin, sells you the cure, which is redemption, but it never works. You're still a horrible, awful sinner. Well, what does this do for the mental state of a normal person to be taught that no matter what you do, you're just a vile, reprehensible Donald Trump in your own neighborhood, you know? This should be appraised for what it is. It is a form of mental oppression that is brought down upon people who don't need to spend their lives living under that kind of oppression. And that's what we say as atheists. We are mentally free of these ideologies. We don't think about these concepts like sin and evil and so on.
We think about good and bad and being good people.
Absolutely.
But not because we're inherently bad.
Or we don't do good because we think we're being judged by some almighty God, and it's the only way
we're going to get a reward later.
We understand that we have one shot at life and we need to make the best of it.
Exactly.
I think I've been told, and I think it's true, that's how slaves were kept in line. And that's why they were so religious, and essentially the black culture remains deeply religious today in our society, because they were taught, don't worry about how miserable your life is. Don't worry about how much work you do that you never get compensated for. Don't worry that you get whipped and beaten and live in a stone shack and eat the worst food. When you die, you're going to live in utopia. But there's no evidence offered that anybody's ever going to survive life. We see none. We see no evidence of any God, any angel, any soul, any heaven or hell. And so given that there's no evidence, we think, well, you know what, maybe we ought to make the most of what we have here. So I think, I understand that Behar probably offered the apology to salvage the program and her position on it. But down deep, we know she really meant what she said. She really understood what she was saying, and she means it. And internally, she didn't retract it, right?
Well, we don't know that because I've never met the woman. I have no idea what she believes. But
well, you know, because that's what she said.
Well, I understand.
She wouldn't say that if she didn't believe it.
Well,
you kidding me?
People say things they don't believe all the time.
Yeah, she gave expression to something which many people are trying to be discreet.
Yes.
And to avoid problems with their TV show, so they don't want to arouse too much controversy. And I guess you can't really blame her for, quote, apologizing, unquote. But I think the very act of saying it, then apologizing for it, brings attention to it.
Yes.
And so... Uh-oh.
That Behar got so much attention that in February the issue was discussed at Disney's annual shareholder meeting. In March, when the chairman Bob Iger addressed the matter during a question and answer session. He said, Behar apologized to Mike Pence directly, which I thought was the right thing to do. She made a call to him and apologized. I happen to take exception to what she said. It wasn't right. Well, I think it was, because I think religion is the most repressive mental disease that has ever plagued the human species. It gripped Western European civilization for hundreds of years during a time appropriately known as the Dark Ages. During that time, there was no advance in science or education or health.
Well, that's not entirely true.
What isn't true?
That there was no advances made. There wasn't any advances made in Europe, but in Islamic countries, they were making great advances scientifically. Even though they had religion, they continued to do scientific advances.
And the same is true for the Chinese.
Yes.
But think about it. What is the movement that's trying to reverse the understandings that we have about, say, for example, homosexuality?
Yeah.
Right? Bible says homosexuals should be stoned to death. Mm-hmm. And yet our Constitution and our Supreme Court has finally joined the 21st century. The 20th was when they should have done it 100 years ago, and say, no, we will not discriminate people because of their sexual preference, because we understand that this is a biological condition that people don't inherently control. They simply recognize it, understand it, and live with it. And in a federal republic with a constitution that protects civil liberties, that's what you do.
And we don't stone adulterers to death, even though it says to in the Bible.
I know.
Well, I don't fault people again for of the Bronze Age who came up with this document. However, I fault us, the people in our own age, who continue to cleave to this 3,000-year-old, totally irrelevant book of mythology as a guide, as a substitute for science.
Which is exactly why
understanding the world as it
Behar
is.
should not have apologized. Because what does Mike Dentz want to do? He wants this country to be a theocracy.
Yes, he does.
You know darn good and well he's the one that came up with DeVos for Education Secretary and that cretin for the Environmental Protection Agency, the Pruitt, that he wants to basically just shut it down. Because they really believe that our country should be essentially a theocracy, and that only these religious principles should apply, which would push us back to the 19th century.
Well, and this would be a good time to segue to Project Blitz.
I could not agree more.
Because the plan of the religious right, which they call Project Blitz, is to protect the free exercise of traditional Judeo-Christian religious values and beliefs in the public square, and to reclaim and properly define the narrative which supports such beliefs.
None of which are under any threat at all.
No.
You can believe whatever you want.
Exactly.
That's what they say. Here's what it means. We want to impose our medievalist ideologies on society, because if we can't convince you with our Bibles to subscribe to it, we want to do it with the policemen.
Right.
In particular, they want to use the legislatures and the laws of the country and practices.
And they're succeeding.
And create the illusion that we
Partially, at
really
least.
are a theocracy, that there's no reason to even think about or question it.
One of the things that they remind people is that success builds success, and you start small and build up. And the primary example of that is the state motto display act that the Florida legislature passed this year, requiring "In God We Trust" to be displayed in every school, every building controlled by a school board. So,
But Blitz, of course, wants to go farther and have it in every public building,
yes,
courthouses,
they wanna
libraries,
go
and on all
farther.
license plates. They want it everywhere you turn.
Yes.
That's what you see. And yet tell me one way in which we trust in any God. Well, it's another topic for another story.
Yes.
It doesn't matter that we don't trust in a God. They want to create the illusion that everybody subscribes to it, everybody believes in it, and it is essentially the
Yes.
zeitgeist of America.
And if they can require us to paste it on our foreheads, then we'll see it in the mirror in the morning.
Right.
You won't be able to get
And
away
so
with it.
those of us who don't subscribe to these superstitions then are the outcasts.
Yes.
We can be legally discriminated against because we aren't going along with the conventional wisdom of the country. And the conventional-
Another thing that is part of their proposal is called civic literacy, and that's on our ballot this fall.
Sounds like a great idea.
It does sound like a great idea, and until they had a great program here in Florida, following the Sandra Day O'Connor program for civic literacy that Bob Graham and another group that I can't think of was promoting, and which the government this past year defunded, basically. Now they want to put it in the Constitution, but as written by the
CRC?
the CRC has it on the Constitution, but all of this is being pushed by the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation. And so you're going to see a lot more things like that. So we've already seen some of their stuff go into law, such as teachers being able, or school employees being able to pray and participate in religious programs with students, which has always been banned and is still banned federally, but they're going to do it. They also do not want intimate sexual relations between unmarried, non-heterosexual couples, or even heterosexual couples if they're not married. And they want reliance on and maintenance of birth gender. So they don't care if you're a transgender person, that you can't do that. And they, of course, want adoption by intact heterosexual marriage-based families.
And of course, an increasingly right-wing Supreme Court can then interpret the Constitution to permit all of this
Yes.
discrimination
I don't
and
think we're
bias.
there.
Yeah, I think we are.
Are we?
He says we are.
Okay.
So keep talking.
All right.
Anyway,
Don't stop now.
um,
We're on the hot stuff here.
the role of religion in the constitutional history of the United States, they claim, should be publicly displayed in courthouses and other
Right.
state buildings. The Bible should be taught as an elective course in public schools.
I don't have a
It's
problem with
all-
that.
And but what they're going to teach is that it is the foundation of the Constitution and our republican form of government. There is absolutely no connection between.
I think-
Otherwise, why they need to invent a Constitution? They would have just said, "Here, it's all figured out in the Bible and the commandments."
I think a comparative religion class should be actually required in public
But they aren't
schools.
going to make it comparative.
I know that.
Miss Adkins.
I
They're going to say
understand
this
that.
one's right and all the rest are wrong. We don't even want to talk about them, right? Even though the
Well,
evidence.
we would certainly favor a critical scientific examination of the Bible and
Yes.
where it came from, its history, how it got
Sure, but
assembled.
that's not
All
what
these
these guys
are
want.
No.
It may not be what they want, but that's what a reasonable and rational person would want to really understand what the Bible is,
Yes.
what it means. And that would be the best way to go about it. It would be completely consistent with our educational goals. However, as you say, Ed, teaching the Bible that's not what they mean. They mean simply, you must believe this.
Yes.
In other words, a course of religious indoctrination rather than examination. So,
Well, I think it all goes hand in hand with what we were talking about in the first part of the program, which is the whole agenda by the conservatives and the conservative legislature to privatize the public schools, because then they don't even need to get this implemented as legislation. Once the
Right.
public school system is dismantled, the private schools can teach whatever they want, and they can follow the 116-page playbook that they've developed to essentially teach that Christianity is the foundation of our country and of our liberties and democracy. None of these ideas are elucidated in the Bible at all, but if that's what they teach, that's what people will end up believing. I think there are three primary reasons that conservatives want to privatize the school. The first one is that you have this enormous state budget in just about every state of billions of dollars that is not being utilized by private enterprise, right? And so no CEO can get himself a $5 million a year salary out of a public education fund. But once it becomes privatized and businesses are in the business of running schools, then they can have these huge salaries, they can have the perks, they can have the golden parachutes, the company car, the vacation plan, the hospitalization plan, and the retirement plan, so they can get these enormous salaries. They can engage in self-dealing contracts like Neil Bush was involved in when his brother was the governor of the state, selling services to the schools at inflated prices with kickbacks or whatever, because there would be no accountability or audit of how the money is spent. They'll make darn sure of that. And finally, hold your thought, when that money is privatized, then large chunks of it can be pulled out to use for political contributions to keep those in power who are implementing that system, to ensure that we never go back to what the state constitution directs us to do, which is the state should provide a free, high-quality public education to everybody. Go ahead, Jim.
and all those things will be prioritized over the actual expense and costs of education.
Right, leaving
The
dollars and
teachers-
cents to actually
Right.
teach the kids, because you don't have a teachers union then, you don't even need teacher certification.
The teachers in those circumstances will be kept at the same relatively low rates of pay as they enjoy presently. So if you really
Probably
if you
even
care
lower.
about education and you care about the future of human society, then you will really closely examine these things, become involved like we do here. Study these things. Without understanding, without being an educated voter, you can't hope to make rational decisions. So part of your job after hearing this broadcast is to go out there and read a book or two, understand history, understand science. Not all of it, just a little bit here and there to get the general drift of the thing. And then, look at what your school boards and the leadership of the schools are suggesting that you do, particularly what the state legislature proposes. And once you have digested all this, we're confident that you will make the right decisions.
Second reason, I think, is to really dumb down the population, because a less literate population that does not do the kinds of things that you just suggested tends to vote for politicians who tell us they have simple solutions to complex problems. And we see that all the way up to the White House today. But by dumbing down and Christianizing the population with these private schools that are not held to state standards for education, you're going to have more voters that don't have the capacity to evaluate complex issues that we deal with, whether it's economic issues or issues about immigration and so on. And so it helps to control the population if they are simply led to believe whatever they're told. And I think, of course, that goes back to Betsy DeVos. She wants to convert our country into theocracy. Everybody falls in line behind the Christian cross and does what they say. You look at the states that are reliably Republican and reliably conservative. They're all the states, the flyover states in the center of the country, right? Not the coastal states. They're the states that spend the lowest amounts of their budgets on education. They have the poorest quality of education, the fewest percentage, or the lowest percentage of their students that go on to become college graduates. They have the highest percentage of people getting public benefits in the form of welfare, Section 8 housing, and food stamps. They have the highest divorce rates, the highest rates of teen pregnancy, and so on. They are the reliably red states: Mississippi, Alabama, Kentucky, Tennessee, South Carolina, Louisiana, and so on. So what does that tell our politicians, right? We want everybody to be like them, so they'll always vote for the conservative candidate with the easy answer. And so that fungus starts to spread into states like Florida, which is a, a toss-up state, right?
Yes.
And this
Purple
is how
state.
to convert it to a perpetually red state, is by dumbing down the education system. And the third reason, I think, is to re-implement segregation, which the federal government has clearly outlawed. When a student goes to a public school, he can be sitting next to somebody from a minority. But a private school, a vouchered private school, can find ways to control the student population and revert back to the kind of segregation that I think a lot of conservatives want.
Well, the private schools can reject a student for any reason.
Any reason at all.
The charter schools theoretically can't do that, but they can make certain requirements in such a way that many poor parents aren't able to meet the criteria, even though they have the voucher or the financial means to get them into the charter school. It may require volunteerism, and if you're a single parent, you may not be able to volunteer, and things like that. So then we end up with the public schools hosting those people who are the poorest, the most needy of students, with the least funds, because all of it's being funneled into the private and charter school systems.
We see it in the subtlest ways, right?
Yeah.
If your student claims to have been bullied,
Yes.
your student can voucher out of the public school. Why
Yes.
not get rid of the bully? Because they want the public schools to turn into this bullying factory that nobody wants to send their kid to, so
Right.
that they will vote for the candidates that support the vouchers, forget about the court rulings, and again, privatize the school system for profit, for segregation, and to dumb down the culture.
I will point out there is an initiative in the CRC this year too, which would allow the state to set up charter schools in any county without the county's permission, and divert funds from the county schools to the charter school without the county having any input into it.
Wow.
So
And think
that's
about-
a ballot initiative you need to look at carefully, which is why we also encourage you to vote by mail, so you can examine I can't remember, 15, 17 initiatives on the ballot this year to change the Florida Constitution.
But think of what all this means. Suppose they succeed. Suppose that we fail, that the democratic project fails, and what that will mean to our descendants. And what kind of society will they be living in? One without much in the way of scientific progress, one that cannot compete on the world economic stage, one in which racial segregation, racism at large, and prejudice and discrimination against minorities of all kinds will be
And give right. So what we were saying is that it would also give a lot more fodder and rise to these nationalistic parties that
That's right.
we're seeing already in Western Europe, and of course in this country too. Well, we saw that in Charlotte, West Virginia, right?
And what kind of a
Endorsed
harsh...
by our president, who said, "Oh, these are
Right,
fine people."
Exactly.
Yeah, that was
And what
West
kind
Virginia.
of a harsh and inhumane society would that be? We're already seeing it. Look at the division that currently exists between the two ideological camps, liberal and conservative, expressed in our contemporary politics. And what's it going to mean in the future when we are unable to respond to the requirements of, pardon me, certain kinds of fundamental changes in our environment?
But at the same time, are we not promoting that division with having such a harsh attitude towards the imposition of Christian or the Christian faith?
Well, I think not, because it's the urban legend that there's this war on Christianity, when those of us who live free of it want our civil liberties protected by not having Christianity imposed on the culture at large. Freedom of religion also means freedom from religion, that we should be able to live our lives without needing to subscribe to these ideas. We should not need to give an oath to a God or anything like that. We shouldn't need to proclaim that we trust in a God.
I agree with you there, but we are at the same time accusing half the population of the U.S. of being mentally ill.
Well, but the religion that inflicts them, in my opinion, is. But that doesn't mean they don't have the freedom to believe what they want, to support their churches, and even to teach their children what they want. But they have no business sending the bill to us to do that.
Exactly.
Okay, and that's exactly what they're trying to do. And that's what Romano was expressing in his column when he says the bigger picture is that the state has created an uneven playing field now. It's pushing private and charter schools as being more innovative and parent-friendly, while at the same time handcuffing traditional public schools with more and more onerous regulations. Surely, he says, there's something in those religious textbooks that covers hypocrisy. Well, I've said it before and I've said it again, and I'll say it again.
No doubt.
The first step to being a conservative is to master the art of hypocrisy. Right? I mean, look at who they have as the leader of their party now. The most reprehensible pig that's come on into the American culture and as long as we can remember. An adulterer, a guy who doesn't pay his workers, a guy who's a pathological liar, a guy who's a horrible businessman, and the Christian right holds him up as their their leader, the emblem of.
Did you say he has some bad qualities? What are those?
So anyway, we need to speak up for our protections as atheists. That's what we do at Atheists of Florida. And we invite you to visit our website, if you like, where you can see archives of these programs and some of the issues that we're concerned with and find out why we're concerned with. That's going to be at atheistsofflorida.com. And you can find our programs on our website at talk.aof.NGO also.
And don't forget YouTube.
And YouTube.
Yes.
So we have a YouTube channel, Atheists of Florida.
So we're a nonprofit membership organization. We're not in it for the money, even though Joe is, but he's not here. But we're in it because if people don't speak out against this, then it becomes the social norm to accept it, that everybody should be religious, even if it doesn't seem to make sense. And a lot of people are taught never to challenge these ideas, just to accept them at face value, because that's the way it's always been. Well, it shouldn't, because when we look at them at face value and see how repressive they are, both to entire cultures all the way down to individuals, we see that these ideas belong in the past, not in the present. They are not progressive ideas, they're repressive ideas. And the sooner that our culture can live without them, the happier we think everybody will be.
And let's remember also that almost everyone, whether they're conservative,
okay, listen,
liberal,
I
or
hope
any
you'll
other
join
thing.
us again next week when we'll be joined in the studio by Atheists of Florida member Jim Young, who will tell us about the positive consequences of atheism. And now, along with Jim Peterson and Judy Adkins, I'm Ed Golly, reminding you if the story seems a little too implausible to be true, don't believe it just because somebody wrote it down.
Make them prove it.